The moment my daughter pushed a crisp, cream-colored piece of paper across my own dining table, I knew the child I raised was gone. I am Audrey Simmons, 66 years old. I live in a quiet, sensible neighborhood in Ohio. My husband passed away 3 years ago, leaving me this 4-bedroom house fully paid off. Last Sunday, I spent 3 hours cooking a pot roast for my daughter Sarah and her husband David. They have been occupying my guest wing for 2 years, supposedly saving for their own place. Halfway through dinner, the atmosphere shifted. Sarah dropped her fork, reached into her designer bag, and slid a document toward my plate. "We just want you not to be our shameless mom." Sarah stated, her tone dripping with unearned superiority. "David's parents are visiting next week. We just don't want you to embarrass us. We need clear boundaries." I picked up the paper. It was a printed contract. It detailed a $5,000 yearly stipend for me to handle all household chores, laundry, and babysit their future children. At the very bottom, a line waited for my signature. They were offering to pay me a pathetic allowance to be a servant in my own home. David didn't even have the courage to meet my eyes. He just focused intently on chewing his food. I didn't yell. I didn't burst into tears. Crying implies you are a victim, and I have never been a victim. I simply read the absurd terms. They wanted me to clean their bathroom twice a week. "You see, Mom," Sarah continued, mistaking my silence for submission, "you're on a fixed income. This helps you out, and it makes sure our household runs smoothly." I folded the paper neatly in half, slipped it into my cardigan pocket, and picked up my water glass. "I'll think about it," I replied softly. Sarah smiled, looking victorious. But she had absolutely no idea what I was actually thinking about. When my husband died, the silence in this big house was deafening. So when Sarah tearfully asked if she and David could move in to save for a down payment, I agreed. I cleared out 2 rooms for them. I thought I was helping my family get a head start. But entitlement is a slow, creeping weed. It started with small things. David leaving his muddy boots on my vintage rug. Sarah replacing my living room curtains with awful gray blinds because my taste was outdated. They stopped offering to chip in for groceries after the 3rd month. They treated the house like a free hotel and me like the invisible staff. I let it slide initially. I was grieving, and picking battles felt exhausting. But grief fades, and clarity returns. Over the last few months, I noticed Sarah acting less like a guest and more like a landlord. She started rearranging my kitchen cabinets. She threw away my favorite ceramic bowls without asking. The Maid contract was just the final, arrogant peak of a mountain they had been building for 2 years. They truly believed I was a helpless old widow, dependent on their vibrant, youthful presence to keep me going. After dinner that night, Sarah and David retreated to their wing, leaving their dirty plates on the table. Usually, I would load them into the dishwasher before wiping down the counters. Not tonight. I stacked their dirty plates, carried them down the hall, and set them carefully on the floor right outside their bedroom door. Then I went to the laundry room. David's work shirts were piled in the basket, waiting for my Sunday ironing routine. I picked up the basket, walked back to their door, and dumped the wrinkled shirts right on top of the dirty plates. I walked into my master bedroom, locked the door, and slept more soundly than I had in years. The rules of the house were about to change. Monday morning started with a heavy thud in the hallway. I was in the kitchen sipping my black coffee when I heard David stumble over the pile of dirty dishes outside his door. "What the hell?" David muttered loudly. A minute later, Sarah stormed into the kitchen holding one of David's wrinkled dress shirts. Her face was flushed with irritation. "Ah, Mom, what is this?" Sarah demanded, waving the fabric. "David has a major presentation today. You always iron his shirts on Sunday night." I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm ceramic against my palms. I looked at her calmly. "I haven't signed the contract yet, Sarah. I replied. So my employment hasn't officially begun. Sarah blinked, completely thrown off balance by my flat tone. She expected me to apologize, to scramble, to act like a forgetful old woman. When I didn't move, she scoffed. Unbelievable. Come on, David. We'll take it to the dry cleaners. She snapped, grabbing her keys. They slammed the front door behind them. The moment their car pulled out of the driveway, I went straight to the utility closet. I picked up the internet router. I didn't need to call a technician. I simply flipped it over, logged into the administrator portal on my iPad, and changed the Wi-Fi password. Next, I opened the massive stainless steel refrigerator. It was packed with expensive organic steaks, artisanal cheeses, and imported sparkling water that I paid for, but only they consumed. I grabbed 3 large garbage bags. I didn't throw the food away. I'm not wasteful. I packed the premium items into insulated coolers and drove them straight to the local community food pantry. When I returned, the fridge contained only my essentials: milk, eggs, some vegetables, and my favorite brand of iced tea. If they wanted a hotel experience, they would have to start paying the room rate. I sat on the porch, waiting for them to come home. Sarah and David returned around 6 p.m. looking exhausted and carrying takeout bags. David immediately collapsed onto the living room sofa and pulled out his laptop to work. Less than a minute later, he groaned. Sarah, the internet is down. Sarah marched over to the router, unplugging it and plugging it back in furiously. Mom, did you mess with the Wi-Fi? I updated the network security. I answered from my armchair, turning a page of my book. Well, what's the new password? David needs to work. I looked up, meeting her demanding gaze. It's my private network, Sarah. You two make excellent salaries. I suggest you call a provider tomorrow and have your own line installed in your rooms. Her jaw actually dropped. She stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Before she could launch into an argument, she stomped into the kitchen to grab a drink. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before she yelled, "Where is all the food?" Sarah stormed back into the living room, pointing blindly toward the kitchen. "The steaks, the cheese, everything. Did you throw it out?" "I donated it," I stated simply. I realized I was overspending on groceries I don't eat. From now on, I will only purchase my own meals. There is a shelf cleared for you in the fridge. Feel free to fill it. David slowly closed his laptop. He looked terrified. "Sarah, let's just go eat our takeout in the room." "No," Sarah snapped. She turned to me, her eyes narrowing. "I know what you're doing. You're throwing a tantrum over a piece of paper. We are trying to establish a professional household dynamic, and you're acting like a child." I closed my book with a soft, definitive thud. "A professional dynamic requires rent, Sarah. You pay nothing. You own nothing here." She crossed her arms, a mean smirk forming. "We'll see about that." I watched them retreat. She was planning something, but she was severely underestimating me. For the next 3 days, an icy cold war settled over the house. Sarah and David bought their own groceries and kept entirely to themselves. They set up a mobile hotspot for their internet. I enjoyed the absolute peace and quiet. But on Thursday morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy scrubbing. I walked into the hallway to find a professional cleaning crew washing the baseboards. Sarah was standing in the foyer directing them. "Make sure the dining room chandeliers is dusted," she ordered a worker. "Sarah, what is going on here?" I asked, pulling my robe tighter. She turned to me with a brilliant, entirely fake smile. "David's parents, Richard and Eleanor, are coming for dinner tomorrow night. Since you clearly aren't up to maintaining the house to a presentable standard, I hired professionals." She paused, letting her insulting words hang in the air before delivering the final blow. "Also, I've hired a caterer. I'd appreciate it if you stayed in your room tomorrow evening. We have some important family matters to discuss with his parents, and we don't need you hovering around making things awkward." She was trying to banish me from my own dining room. She was attempting to play the wealthy hostess in a house she didn't own, using my roof to impress her wealthy in-laws, while treating me like an embarrassing relative to be hidden in the attic. I didn't argue. I didn't tell her she had no right. Arguing gives them power. Action takes it away. "I see," I replied smoothly. "Enjoy your dinner party." I turned around and walked back into my bedroom. I walked straight to my closet, reached the top shelf, and pulled down a heavy, fireproof lockbox. I spun the combination dial. Inside were the documents my husband and I had meticulously organized before his passing. I pulled out a thick manila folder. It was time to remind my daughter exactly whose ground she was standing on. Inside the manila folder was the original deed to the house. It clearly stated my name, Audrey Simmons, as the sole owner. There was no mortgage. There were no liens. The property was entirely mine. Sarah had always assumed my husband left us with massive debt. She assumed my fixed income meant I was barely scraping by, secretly desperate for their financial help. She had no idea about the life insurance or the well-funded investment accounts. I never discussed money because it was tacky. That silence had allowed her arrogance to completely overgrow reality. I placed the deed on my dresser. Next to it, I placed the cream-colored $5,000 Maid contract she had tried to force on me. That afternoon, while Sarah and David were at work, I went into their guest wing. I didn't destroy anything. I didn't throw their things on the lawn. I simply went into their closet, pulled out 3 large suitcases they used for vacations, and set them gently on their bed. I opened their drawers and began neatly folding David's sweaters and Sarah's expensive jeans. I packed them efficiently, respectfully. I emptied their bathroom cabinets, placing their toiletries into waterproof bags. I stripped their bed of my good linen sheets. By 4 p.m., their entire existence in my home was neatly contained in 3 heavy suitcases and 4 cardboard boxes stacked neatly by the back door in the mudroom. I locked the door to the guest wing. At 5 p.m., the caterers arrived to set up the dining room. I let them in, smiling politely. I went to my room, took a warm shower, and put on a tailored navy blue dress I usually saved for the theater. I pinned my hair up and clasped my favorite pearl necklace around my neck. I looked in the mirror. I didn't look like a maid. I looked like the owner. I walked down the hall and waited for the guests to arrive. At 6:30 p.m., the doorbell rang. I heard Sarah rushing from the kitchen, her heels clicking rapidly on the hardwood floor. She swung the door open, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Richard, Eleanor. Come in, come in. Welcome to our home." Sarah beamed. I stood quietly in the shadow of the hallway watching. Eleanor handed Sarah a bottle of wine, looking around the foyer with an approving nod. "It's a beautiful property, Sarah. You and David have done so well for yourselves." Eleanor complimented, taking off her coat. "Thank you," Sarah lied effortlessly. "We've put a lot of work into maintaining it. It's tough managing such a large estate, but we manage." They moved into the dining room where the caterers had set up an elegant spread. David was pouring water into crystal glasses, looking highly uncomfortable. "Where is your mother, Sarah?" Richard asked, casually taking a seat. "Is she joining us?" Sarah waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, Mom prefers to eat early and stay in her room. She gets confused easily these days. Honestly, she's more like our live-in help, but we do what we can for family." That was my cue. I stepped out of the shadows and walked confidently into the bright dining room. I didn't shuffle. I walked with my spine perfectly straight. "Good evening, Richard. Eleanor, how lovely to see you." I greeted warmly, my voice clear and steady. Sarah froze. The fake smile shattered instantly. Her eyes darted to my tailored dress, panic flashing across her face. "Mom!" Sarah hissed, her teeth clenched. "What are you doing? I told you—" I ignored her completely. I walked directly to the head of the long mahogany table, the seat Sarah had clearly reserved for David, and sat down gracefully. I unfolded a linen napkin and placed it on my lap. "Please sit down, everyone," I commanded gently. "Welcome to my home." The atmosphere in the dining room turned instantly suffocating. Eleanor and Richard exchanged a very confused, awkward glance before slowly lowering themselves into their chairs. Sarah stood rigidly at the side of the table, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "Mom, get up. That is David's seat. You need to go back to your room." "I am perfectly comfortable right here, Sarah," I replied, taking a slow sip from my water glass. David finally spoke up, his voice trembling slightly. "Audrey, please. We're just trying to have a nice evening." I reached into the small clutch purse resting on my lap. I pulled out the cream-colored contract and placed it flat in the center of the table, right next to the floral centerpiece. Then I pulled out the heavy manila folder and laid the original house deed right beside it. "I wanted to return this to you, Sarah," I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "I will not be signing it." Richard adjusted his glasses, leaning forward slightly. "What is that?" "It is an employment contract," I explained calmly to Richard, never taking my eyes off my daughter. "Sarah and David offered to pay me $5,000 a year to be their live-in maid, handle their laundry, and clean their bathrooms. They felt my presence in the house was an embarrassment unless I was serving them." Eleanor gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest. She stared at David in absolute horror. "David, is this true?" David looked at the floor, his face the color of ash. He couldn't speak. "Mom, stop it," Sarah shouted, finally losing her carefully crafted composure. "You are ruining everything you are living in our house. You should contribute." I tapped my manicured fingernail directly on the official house deed. "Look closely at the name on that document, Sarah," I instructed coldly. Sarah's eyes darted to the paper. She saw my name typed in bold ink. "Sole owner." Sarah stared at the deed as if it were a venomous snake. The illusion she had sold to her in-laws and perhaps even to herself evaporated in a single, silent second. "This house is fully paid for by me and your late father." I stated, the silence in the room heavy enough to crack the fine china. "I pay the property taxes. I pay the utilities. You have lived here rent-free for 2 years while treating me with absolute contempt." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the spare set of house keys they had given themselves when they first moved in. I dropped them onto the table with a sharp metallic clatter. "I don't need to argue, and I certainly don't need a shouting match." I continued, looking directly at David. "I have packed all of your belongings. They are sitting in suitcases in the mudroom. I expect you both to take them and leave tonight." "You can't do this!" Sarah shrieked, tears of sheer humiliation finally welling in her eyes. "Where are we supposed to go at 7 p.m. on a Friday?" "You have 2 excellent incomes," I reminded her smoothly. "I am sure a hotel will be more than happy to accommodate you until you find the house you've supposedly been saving for." Richard slowly stood up from the table. He looked deeply embarrassed, refusing to even look at his son. "Eleanor, get your coat," Richard muttered sharply. He looked at me, offering a brief, respectful nod. "Audrey, I am so deeply sorry for this intrusion. We had absolutely no idea." "I know, Richard. Have a safe drive home," I replied graciously. David's parents practically sprinted out the front door, eager to escape the radioactive fallout of their son's lies. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving just the 3 of us in the dining room. The caterer, sensing the disaster, had quietly slipped into the kitchen. Sarah looked at me, her face pale. She finally realized I held all the control. There was no dramatic screaming match after David's parents left. The absolute finality in my voice had drained the fight right out of them. David quietly went to the mudroom, saw the neatly packed bags, and began loading them into the trunk of his car in the dark. Sarah lingered in the hallway. She looked at me, waiting for me to break, waiting for the motherly guilt to kick in and tell her it was all a harsh lesson she could apologize away. "Mom!" She started, her voice finally small and uncertain. "The door is behind you, Sarah," I said, turning away to help the caterer clear the untouched plates. They pulled out of the driveway just before 9 p.m. The moment their taillights faded down the street, I locked the front door and engaged the deadbolt. The next morning, I called a local handyman and had every exterior lock on the house changed. It cost me $250 a bargain for total peace of mind. The house was incredibly quiet that weekend, but it wasn't the lonely, echoing silence I had felt after my husband passed. It was a clean, breathable silence. It was the sound of a space that belonged entirely to me again. I didn't block Sarah's phone number. I am not cruel. But when she texted me 3 days later asking if they could come back to talk things out, I simply replied, "I am available for lunch on Tuesday at the diner downtown. My home is no longer open to guests." She didn't reply. That was fine with me. I poured myself a cup of hot black coffee, walked out onto the back porch, and sat in my favorite rocking chair. I watched the morning sun filter through the oak trees in my backyard. I didn't have any laundry to do. I didn't have any meals to cook for ungrateful people. I had my house, I had my dignity, and I had my absolute freedom. And that was worth far more than $5,000.